Hey everyone in 105, jumping back in for the other half of talking about the movies. So, we'd covered technology in the previous ones. We'll try and get through business and the cultural side of things in this video. I will cut myself off to keep this from running on forever. I know you've got things to do. But let's jump into the business side of things. So, the movie industry is a mostly a direct payment marketplace. If you want to see a movie, you are going to have to exchange your hard earned money for it. The biggest exception, I would say, is watching a movie on regular television. If you are just watching NBC and I don't know, they start airing the first Avengers movie or something like that, that's indirect payment all the way, for the most part. But every other form of watching a movie, buying a movie ticket, buying a DVD or Blu-ray, having a subscription to a streaming service, downloading a DVD on a movie onto your hard drive, all of these are direct payment with varying costs attached to each one of them. Um, and most of that money goes to the studios that release these movies. Now, how the studios then redistribute the money to the different producers and all, it's super complicated. We're not going to get into all of that. But on the simplest level, it's a direct payment marketplace. You've got to pay for a movie, and the marketplace is also an oligopoly. There are only a handful of major movie studios in the United States, and by virtue of that, in the global movie market, the American movie industry, Hollywood, has dominated the global marketplace since about 100 years ago. Up until 1914, French companies had been the dominant force in global cinema, with British and German and Italian companies all doing pretty well. And America was part of that race, but it was a competition. By 1920, completely reversed because World War I devastates Europe and especially the European film industry. Hollywood is not affected by it at all, really, and so they just use that 6 year gap to erase the competition. It has been Hollywood's world ever since then. That will change inevitably at some point, notably a couple of years ago, for the first time in I don't even know how long. A movie made outside the United States and without American money or really much of an American release was in the top 10 movies of the year. It was a Chinese action film, but that is going to continue happening. Now, that being said, like I said, it's an oligopoly, and there's just a handful of major studios to know. The dominant one right now is Disney. Disney, of course, releases Walt Disney Pictures, but they also release Pixar. They release Marvel and Star Wars, and I'm forgetting all of the other franchises and studios that they've bought up. They have absolutely dominated box office revenue, movie ticket sales in the past couple of years here, especially through Marvel animated and Star Wars films. If you take a look at the highest grossing movie of the year for the past 5 years, I want to say Disney has the number one movie of the year every year going back to 2014. That is a remarkable run of success. They've, in fact, gotten so big and so powerful that last year they gobbled up one of the other major film studios. 20th Century Fox was part of a major buyout where that's now just a subsidiary studio of Disney. And in fact, they are no longer using the Fox name. Disney is seemingly thinks that that's too heavily associated with stuff like Fox News, so it's now just 20th Century Studios and Searchlight Pictures, both of which are part of the Disney empire. The other major studios are Universal, which is ultimately owned by Comcast. There's Paramount, which is now a subsidiary of the CBS Corporation after a weird series of mergers and splits and then remergers. But yeah, Paramount is part of Viacom, which is now owned by CBS after another merger. You also have Warner Brothers, which was part of Time Warner. Nowadays, it's part of AT&T. And then the last of our major film studios, what am I playing? We got Disney. We've got Universal, owned by Comcast. Is that the one I'm? Yeah, Universal, owned by Comcast. Warner Brothers, owned by AT&T. Paramount, owned by CBS. And our last one is eluding me, and I'm sitting in a room with bad Wi-Fi, which means I can't look it up very easily. It's Sony. Sony Pictures, which is both Sony itself as a brand name as well as Columbia TriStar. That's the other major American film studio. Despite the fact that Sony is a Japanese company, it's considered a Hollywood film studio. Whatever. But those five companies pull in the vast majority of the revenue. They have the biggest resources. They're really competing against one another. Now, that being said, not everybody is trying to beat Disney at their own game. Warner Brothers seems like they would like to, with stuff like DC, trying to be sort of a rival to the Avengers movies. Eh. Universal hasn't really tried to go that Disney route. They've been pretty happy to collect money in other ways. And then a company like Paramount is just flopping around like a dead fish. For a lot of kind of sad reasons, Paramount had, as recently as the 90s, been one of the most prominent studios in Hollywood. These days, they are waiting to be bought out by an even larger company. Now, the wild card here, and it's a wild card because we don't know quite how it competes with the others, is Netflix. Netflix is a streaming video service for the most part these days, though I'm one of those who was old enough to have first signed up when it was a DVD delivery service. Wild to remember that. But Netflix does release original movies. They put them in theaters for brief runs and then move them over to Netflix. And they are quite prominent movies sometimes. This past year, there were two Netflix films nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars: The Irishman and Marriage Story. That is something that's going to continue to happen. And Netflix obviously would prefer that you not go to the movies and pay for Frozen 2. They would prefer that you just watch, something on Netflix. Uh, they're not competing for your dollar in quite the same way for the most part. They're not a studio for the most part, but they're part of this conversation. They are a heavy hitter in Hollywood at this point, much to the resentment of the traditional Hollywood studios. Now, there are smaller independent studios as well. Lionsgate is the most well known of these. They released the Hunger Games movies, the Twilight movies. They really nailed the young adult adaptation market there. But they are much smaller in terms of their revenue and their resources outside of the occasional big hits, like the aforementioned young adult adaptations. And it's worth noting that Hollywood is the movie business, I should say, is just one point in the larger mass media competition between these big companies. Our major players here, Disney, AT&T, Comcast, CBS, Sony, movies are not their main source of revenue. They are a relatively small part of the revenue for a lot of these companies. Maybe Disney puts more emphasis on it than all the others because they don't have home electronics or cable and internet service that they provide. I think. I don't think. Yeah, anyway, but the CEO of Disney is responsible for a lot more than just what movies come out and how they do at the box office. That is definitely something that gets judged, but the competition between Walt Disney Pictures and Warner Brothers Pictures is just one battle in a much larger conflict over your attention and your money between AT&T and the larger Walt Disney Corporation. Okay. And that's why I mentioned that they're all corporate subsidiaries. Now, the other thing I want to mention here, and I hate that I've got to cram it into just a couple of minutes here, but what you're going to do, I don't want to make you sit on YouTube all day, is talking about the cultural side of analyzing Hollywood and the movie industry. And some of the stuff here, I think I'll be able to roll over into talking about TV in a couple of weeks. But for the most part, when we are talking about movies, we are talking about entertainment. Movies, along with TV and just various internet related things, are probably the most prominent forms of entertainment in the United States. And I want to point out, when we talk about entertainment, at least traditional entertainment, like movies, television, music to some degree, books, we are talking about stories. That is the bedrock of how humans are entertained. We tell each other stories. And American movies have a very, very well honed, I think you would say, method for telling stories, the Hollywood narrative system. There's a couple of key elements that I can tell you about in a quick moment here. The most important part of it is to have active, psychologically motivated, goal-oriented characters. When you are watching a movie, you are really there to see the characters, to see how they bounce off of one another, how they think, how they feel, and what they are trying to do. So if you look at something like Mulan, which was going to come out this past month, if not for the coronavirus outbreak, the main character there, Mulan, is a young Chinese girl who replaces her father in the military during a time of war and conscription, and so she has this conflict within herself between her family expectations. She should be a good wife, not a good soldier. That's not a womanly role. And between generations, she thinks she's letting down her parents. There's also social conflict about women's place in society and family honor. All of this stuff gets rolled up into the motivation that pushes Mulan to join the army and then defeat the Mongols or whatever, however they're going to tell that story. But when you're watching Mulan, the main thing you care about is how Mulan works through her psychology and tries to achieve her goal of upholding the family honor in her own way, not by following her parents or society's guidelines for how women should behave or how honor should be upheld. That's really what you care about, not necessarily the cool action with the jumping and the flying and the swords and all that. That is cool, that's part of the spectacle, but you really care about the characters when you're watching a well-made story. So characters and motivation are the main part that we are there for, and you have, of course, the protagonist, who's our main character. We want to see them succeed. The antagonist, the opposing character, who we want to see fail. Supporting characters in a lot of different guises. All of them are part of this fabric of psychology and action that we are invested in. Now, you still need to put together the beats of this story in a way that we find functional, I guess is the way to say this. And so that's what's called narrative. What's the word I was looking for? Narrative structure. There we go. There are different ways of telling a story, but generally speaking, you do not tell a story beginning with the earliest possible moment in all of that story action and ending at the last possible moment. Chronological narrative is relatively rare because it's relatively uninteresting. Instead, you have what I typically like to prefer calling a 4-act narrative structure. There's different ways of dividing this. Some people say 3 acts, some people say 5 acts. But generally speaking, and I wish I had the whiteboard to really show this to you, but generally speaking, if you imagine a story is like a line on the board, it's 2 hills. It goes kind of flat, jumps up, down, jumps even higher, down again. That beginning section, the flat over here, that is Act 1, setting the stage, where you meet the characters, you're introduced to the setting, you figure out their motivation, their character personality traits, you discover the central conflict. All of that is Act 1. Act 2 is that initial hill where we are trying to meet the initial goal, trying to reach that initial pinnacle. Usually there is some sort of mixed climax where part of the goal is achieved, but part of it fails. Or maybe the action just resets and now there's a new goal that will have to be achieved in the second half of the film. My favorite example of this, by the way, is Titanic. Titanic is a fabulously entertaining movie and also a astoundingly unoriginal movie. It follows this structure like James Cameron, the writer and director, was terrified of ever doing anything different ever in his life. But essentially, Act 2 is the story of Jack and Rose's romance in Titanic. Will they or won't they? Well, we know that this is a grand historical romance, so of course they will. So the climax of Act 2 is when they have sex in the car below decks. The climax is when they climax. I've used that joke for years. I wasn't going to stop just because I'm on YouTube. Now, what happens immediately after they have sex in the car? The ship runs into an iceberg. And that is a lesson to everybody, especially in these days of social isolation. Premarital sex leads to icebergs, so be warned. Now, after the iceberg hits the Titanic and the ship is going to sink, the motivations change. No longer is it about will they, won't they? They did. Now it is will they survive together? Turns out they will not, which is why we go to the movies, right? The boat sinks. They're on the boat when it goes down. Somebody has to die. Turns out it's Jack, but Rose holds him in her heart forever. That's the I'll never let go. And then if you remember, the old lady Rose is telling us this whole story, and as she finishes the story and all the men are crying, she goes out that night and drops the heart of the ocean, that priceless jewel, down into the water, so her heart will always be with Jack, and then she dies in the night, and we all leave the theater crying to Celine Dion. That is a perfect 5-act structure. It sets up our characters, sets up the setting, creates social conflicts, psychological conflicts, action, life or death conflicts, and resolves all of them in a way that makes us excited and thrilled and moved. And there's a reason that movie was made $750 million when it came out in 1997. It's a well-made story. All right. Now, there's more stuff when it comes to the cultural analysis of the movies, but we'll have to leave that for some other time, probably when we talk about TV in a few weeks. Have a good spring break.